You were too busy playing hero at the hospital to hold your own father's hand while he died, Natalie. You do not deserve a single penny. Get out of this house. My sister Megan's voice cut through the crowded parlor. I am Natalie Brooks, a 32-year-old emergency room nurse. I did not cry. I simply watched her hand tighten around our father's silver handbell. Megan thought she had won. She did not know I had the medical files in my bag that would destroy her world. Like and subscribe only if you believe the truth eventually finds its way home. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. I have spent the last 12 years of my life in the fluorescent frantic world of the emergency room. As a nurse, I have learned that trauma has a specific smell, a mixture of antiseptic, copper, and unwashed fear. I have held the hands of strangers as they took their final breaths, and I have delivered news that shattered families into a million jagged pieces. But nothing in my professional life ever prepared me for the cold, calculated destruction of my own home. My sister Megan is 3 years older than me, and she has always been a master of the surface. She is a high-end real estate agent in Portland, a woman who sells dreams while living in a carefully constructed lie. Growing up, Megan was the golden child who stayed within the lines, while I was the one who came home with scraped knees and a stubborn silence. When our father Thomas was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's 6 years ago, the cracks in our family dynamic became canyons. At first, I tried to be there. I adjusted my shifts, working 48 hours straight so I could drive the 3 hours back to my childhood home in the suburbs of Seattle. I wanted to help with the medications, the physical therapy, and the complex bureaucratic nightmare of healthcare. But Megan had already moved back into the guest suite. She had already whispered in our mother's ear that my presence was too disruptive. Natalie is so high-strung from the hospital, Megan would say, her voice dripping with a fake, honeyed concern. She brings that negative energy here. Dad needs peace, not a drill sergeant in scrubs. Slowly I was pushed to the edges of the room. My mother Evelyn has always been a gentle soul, the kind of woman who prefers to look away from conflict until it disappears. She leaned on Megan's strength, or what looked like strength. Megan took over the finances, the appointments, and most importantly, the silver handbell. That bell was a family heirloom, a delicate piece of Victorian silver that had belonged to our grandmother. Dad used to keep it on his nightstand. He would ring it twice when he wanted a cup of Earl Grey tea, and 3 times when he just wanted someone to sit with him. It was a sound that used to mean connection, but under Megan's management that bell became a weapon of control. By the 4th year of Dad's illness, Megan had convinced our mother that I was too busy with my career to care. Every time I called, Megan would answer his phone. He's sleeping, Natalie. He had a rough night because he was so upset you missed his birthday. I didn't miss it, Megan, I would reply, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. I sent the gift and you told me he wasn't up for visitors that weekend. Did I? Oh, I must have been so exhausted from doing everything myself that I forgot. I started sending $500 every 2 weeks to help with the private nursing care Megan claimed we needed. I worked double shifts, skipping meals and sleep, just to make sure my parents never wanted for anything. I was the silent bank account, while Megan was the public face of the devoted daughter. The turning point came 18 months ago. I decided to drop by without calling. I didn't want to give Megan time to prepare a script. When I walked into the house, it was eerily quiet. The air felt heavy, like it was held down by thick layers of dust. I found my father in the sunroom, staring blankly at a television that wasn't even turned on. He looked smaller than I remembered. His skin was the color of old parchment, and his hands, which used to be so steady, were resting limply on his lap. The silver handbell was sitting on the side table, just out of his reach. Dad, I whispered, kneeling beside him. He didn't turn his head. His pupils were pinpoint small tiny black dots that didn't react to the sunlight streaming through the window. As a nurse, my internal alarm didn't just ring, it screamed. He wasn't just suffering from Parkinson, he was heavily sedated. He was drifting in a chemical fog that had no business being part of his treatment plan. What are you doing here? Megan's voice whipped across the room. She was standing in the doorway, her hands on her hips, her eyes flashing with a dangerous intensity. He over-medicated, Megan, I said, standing up to face her. Why is he on such a high dose of benzodiazepines? I saw his chart months ago and this doesn't match. You saw a chart from months ago, she hissed, stepping closer. You aren't his doctor, Natalie. You're just a nurse who thinks she knows everything because she cleans up after strangers. Mother and I decided this was best for his anxiety. He was getting violent. He was hurting us. I looked at my father's frail frame. The idea of him being violent was a grotesque lie. Before I could respond, my mother walked in, her face pale and drawn. Natalie, please, Mom said, her voice shaking. Megan is doing so much for us. She hasn't slept in days. If the doctor says he needs to be calm, then he needs to be calm. Don't come in here and start a fight. I'm not starting a fight, Mom. I'm worried about his safety. If you were so worried, Megan interrupted, her voice rising for the benefit of the neighbors she knew were listening through the open windows. You would be here more than once every 3 months. But you're not. You're out living your life while I'm here changing his clothes and listening to him cry for a daughter who never shows up. The guilt they pressed into my chest felt like lead. I was forced out that day, escorted to my car by Megan's sharp tongue and my mother's tearful silence. I didn't stop, though. I started a private log. Every time I spoke to Dad on the rare occasions Megan allowed it, I took notes. I started researching the private pharmacy Megan was using. Then, 3 weeks ago I got the call. Not from Megan, not from my mother. I got a call from Marcus Turner, the family attorney and a longtime friend of my father. Natalie, he said, his voice heavy. Your father passed away 2 hours ago. I thought you should know. 2 hours, I gasped, the world spinning. Why didn't anyone call me? I don't know, Natalie, but there's something else. We need to meet for the reading of the will on Friday. Your father, he left some very specific instructions for you, and he asked me to give you something privately before the rest of the family gathers. I drove through the night, the grief finally breaking through my professional armor. I arrived in time for the funeral, where I was treated like a distant relative, a stranger who had wandered into the wrong chapel. Megan wore a designer black dress and wept gracefully into a silk handkerchief, while I stood in the back, my heart a hollow stone. Now, standing in this parlor after the service, listening to her tell me I don't deserve a penny, I realize the hero she is mocking isn't the nurse she thinks I am. The hero is the woman who spent the last 48 hours uncovering the truth she thought was buried with our father. Target words, 950. After the funeral, I didn't go back to the family house. I couldn't breathe in that air, thick with Megan's expensive perfume and the lingering scent of my father's decline. Instead, I checked into a small nondescript hotel 5 miles away. I spent my nights staring at the ceiling, my mind a chaotic loop of clinical observations and childhood memories. I kept thinking about the silver handbell. When we were kids, it sat on the mantel, a symbol of elegance and tradition. Now, it was a leash Megan used to keep my mother in line. 2 days before the official reading of the will, I met Marcus Turner at a quiet diner on the edge of town. Marcus had been my father's closest friend since law school. He looked older, his shoulders hunched under the weight of his own grief. He slid a small weathered leather journal across the cracked vinyl table toward me. Your father gave this to me 6 months ago, Marcus said, his voice barely a whisper. He told me that if anything happened to him, I was to give it to you and only you. He was very clear that Megan should never know it exists. I opened the journal. My father's handwriting, once bold and fluid, had become a shaky, jagged scrawl. The early entries were mundane weather reports, grocery lists, thoughts on the garden. But as I flipped through the pages, the tone shifted. He started writing about the bitter tea Megan made for him. He wrote about the fog that settled over his brain every time she entered the room. She thinks I'm sleeping, Natalie, one entry read, dated 4 months ago. But I am just frozen. I can hear her on the phone in the hallway. She talking about the house. She talking about selling the Brooks family legacy before I'm even cold. My sweet Natalie, if you're reading this, look at the pharmacy records, look at the signatures. A cold, sharp clarity settled in my chest. This wasn't just neglect. This was a calculated erasure of a man's autonomy. I spent the next 14 hours at my laptop and on the phone, utilizing every professional contact I had in the medical world. As a nurse in a major hospital system, I knew how to navigate the digital footprints of prescriptions. I contacted the small private pharmacy Megan had insisted on using, the one she claimed was the only place that could properly compound his medications. I didn't lead with accusations, I led with my credentials. This is Natalie Brooks, registered nurse and daughter of Thomas Brooks. I'm updating his medical file for the estate's life insurance audit. I need the last 12 months of refill authorizations. Because I was still listed as a secondary contact on his old insurance plan. A detail Megan had overlooked in her rush to seize control, the clerk didn't hesitate. 20 minutes later, an encrypted file landed in my inbox. The numbers didn't lie. The dosage of lorazepam and quetiapine being dispensed was nearly triple what the primary neurologist had originally prescribed. And there, at the bottom of the last 6 authorization forms, were the signatures. They were supposed to be my father, but the loops on the letters were too perfect, the pressure on the pen too consistent. A man with advanced Parkinson couldn't produce a signature that clean. Megan had been forging his name to keep him sedated, effectively turning him into a living ghost while she drained his secondary accounts. I felt a wave of nausea, followed by a searing white-hot anger. But I didn't call the police, not yet. I knew how Megan operated. She would play the martyr. She would say she did it out of love, to keep him from suffering. I needed more than just a paper trail. I needed her to admit it. I decided to drive by the house one last time before the meeting. I saw a large moving soon van parked in the driveway. Megan was already liquidating the furniture. She was selling off Dad's antique tool collection, his vintage records, and even Mom's wedding china. I walked up the driveway, my heart hammering against my ribs. I found Megan in the garage, pointing a manicured finger at a heavy oak workbench. "That goes to the auction house on Monday," she told the two movers. "Make sure you handle it carefully. It's worth at least $4,000. "Megan, what are you doing?" I asked, my voice flat. "The will hasn't even been read. This property is still part of the estate." She turned to me, a smirk playing on her lips. She looked me up and down, lingering on my tired eyes and my simple jeans. "Oh, Natalie, always so literal. Mom gave me power of attorney months ago. I'm just clearing out the clutter. This house is too big for her now. She's moving into a luxury assisted living suite in the city. I've already put down the deposit." "Did Mom agree to this?" "Mom agrees to whatever I tell her is best," Megan snapped. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver handbell, ringing it sharply. A few seconds later, my mother appeared at the back door, looking confused and frail. "See, she comes when I call. She knows who takes care of her." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Megan wasn't just stealing money, she was stealing our mother dignity, using that bell to treat her like a trained animal. "I'm staying for dinner, Mom," I said, ignoring Megan. "There isn't enough food for 3, Megan interjected. "Then I'll eat the air," I replied, stepping past her into the house. "Because I'm not leaving until I see exactly what's left of this family." I sat in the kitchen, watching my mother move like a ghost through her own home. She wouldn't look me in the eye. Every time she started to speak, Megan would chime the silver bell, a soft but commanding sound that made my mother's shoulders tensity. It was a psychological trigger, a Pavlovian response built over months of chemical and emotional manipulation. "Stay with me," because the depth of what I found in that house that night was far worse than a few forged signatures. Before we move into the final confrontation, take a moment to reflect. Have you ever seen someone use care as a disguise for control? As the sun set, I realized that Megan's overconfidence was her greatest weakness. She thought I was the same broken girl who had been pushed out a year ago. She didn't realize that in the emergency room we don't just treat wounds, we find the source of the hemorrhage, and I had finally found hers. Dinner was a silent, suffocating affair. Megan had ordered a cheap Caesar salad from a takeout place, serving it on the fine china she hadn't sold yet. She sat at the head of the table, Dad's old seat, swirling a glass of expensive red wine. Every time my mother reached for the bread, Megan would clear her throat, and Mom would pull her hand back as if she'd been burned. "You look tired, Natalie," Megan said, her voice smooth as glass. "All those night shifts are aging you. You should really consider a desk job, something with less pressure." "I like the pressure, Megan," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "In the ER, you learn to see things people try to hide. You learn to read the body when the mouth is lying." Megan's eyes flickered for a fraction of a second, but she just smiled. "How dramatic. Pass the salt, would you?" I didn't pass the salt. Instead, I watched my mother. Her hands were trembling, a fine rhythmic shake that wasn't just old age, it was a side effect. I knew that tremor. It was a sign of long-term exposure to antipsychotics used off-label for sedation. My heart broke into 1,000 pieces as I realized Megan hadn't stopped with Dad. She was doing the exact same thing to Mom to keep her compliant during the house sale. "Mom," I said, leaning in, "when was the last time you saw your doctor? Not the one Megan takes you to, but Dr. Henderson." Before Mom could answer, the silver handbell chimed. Megan had picked it up from the table and rang it once, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the room. "Mother health is managed, Natalie. We don't need your input." Megan stood up, her face a mask of cold fury. "I think it's time you left. We have a big day tomorrow at the lawyer office and Mom needs her rest. She gets so confused when you're around." I stood up, but I didn't head for the front door. I headed for the guest bathroom, the one Dad used to use. Megan followed me to the hallway, her heels clicking like a countdown on the hardwood floor. I said, "It's time to go," she hissed. "I'm just washing my hands, Megan. Relax." I slipped into the bathroom and locked the door. I had exactly 60 seconds before she'd start banging on it. I didn't go for the sink. I went for the medicine cabinet. I pulled on a pair of thin latex gloves I always keep in my jacket pocket, a habit from the hospital. There, behind the aspirin and the bandages, were 3 small amber bottles with white caps. No labels, no pharmacy names, just handwritten notes on masking tape, morning, noon, and night. I opened the night bottle. The pills inside were small, blue, and unmistakable. It was a heavy-duty sedative, far beyond what a woman of my mother weight and age should ever touch. I took out my phone and snapped 4 clear photos of the bottles and the pills. Then, I noticed something else. Tucked behind the cabinet mirror was a small black plastic case. I pulled it out. It was a digital voice recorder, the kind Dad used to use for his oral history project years ago. I pressed the play button, my thumb shaking. A voice filled the small bathroom. It was Dad. His voice was weak, punctuated by long pauses for breath, but his mind was clear. "This is Thomas Brooks. It is Tuesday, the 14th of October, at 10 o'clock in the evening. Megan thinks I am under. She is in the next room talking to a man named Mr. Reynolds. They are talking about a cash buyer for the house. They are talking about moving Evelyn to a facility in Arizona. Megan, she has forged my signature on the power of attorney." I saw the papers in her bag while she was in the shower. "Natalie, if you find this," I hid the original will in the lining of the Bell velvet box. "I love you both, but the truth must be the last thing I say." The recording ended with a dry, rattling cough. I stood there in the dim light of the bathroom, tears finally spilling over. He had been a prisoner in his own home, fighting for every second of clarity just to leave me a map through the darkness. I tucked the recorder into my bra and put the bottles back exactly as I'd found them. I walked out of the bathroom, my face a mask of professional neutrality. Megan was waiting in the hall, her arms crossed, her foot tapping. "Are you done?" she asked, her voice dripping with venom. "I'm done," I said, "in more ways than you know." I walked out of the house and into the cool night air. I didn't go to the hotel. I drove straight to Marcus Turner's office. I sat in his parking lot for 3 hours until his car pulled in at 7 o'clock the next morning. "Natalie, what are you doing here so early?" Marcus asked, his eyes wide with concern. "I have the evidence, Marcus. Everything. The forgery, the over-sedation, and a recording from my father's final weeks." We spent the next 4 hours in his office. He looked at the photos of the pills. He listened to the recording. He looked at the pharmacy records I had pulled. The silence in the room was heavy, the kind of silence that precedes a massive storm. "This isn't just a civil matter anymore, Natalie," Marcus said, his voice grave. "This is elder abuse and felony fraud. Are you sure you want to do this? She your sister?" "She stopped being my sister the moment she turned my father's house into a prison," I replied. "I'm not doing this for revenge, Marcus. I'm doing this for my mother. She being drugged right now. We have to stop her today." Before I continue with what happened at that final meeting, I want to ask you something. If you were in my shoes, would you protect your sibling future, or would you demand justice for the parent who can no longer speak for themselves? Leave a comment and let me know. This story is a reminder that sometimes the hardest thing to do is the only right thing to do. Now, it was time. The reading of the will was scheduled for 1 o'clock in the afternoon at the family home. Megan wanted the audience. She wanted the theater of her victory. I was going to give it to her. I walked into that parlor at precisely 12:55. The room was full of relatives, aunts, uncles, and cousins who had heard Megan's version of the story for years. They looked at me with pity and judgment, whispering behind their hands about the absent daughter. Megan was standing by the fireplace, the silver handbell in her hand. She looked like a queen surveying her kingdom. She didn't know that the walls were already closing in. The parlor was filled with the smell of damp wool and stale coffee. 14 relatives sat on folding chairs, their eyes darting between me and Megan. My mother sat in the center of the front row, looking like a porcelain doll that had been dropped and glued back together. Her hands were tucked into her sleeves, but I could see the rhythmic twitching of her thumbs. She was sedated again. I could tell by the way her eyelids drifted. Marcus Turner stood at the small mahogany desk, his briefcase open. He looked at me, a silent signal of readiness, then turned to the room. "Thank you all for coming," Marcus began, his voice echoing in the sudden silence. "As the executor of Thomas Brooks' estate, it is my duty to read his final will and testament, dated 2 years ago." "Wait," Megan interrupted, stepping forward. She was holding the silver handbell like a scepter. "Marcus, there must be a mistake. Dad signed a new directive 6 months ago. I have the notarized copy right here. He left the house and the primary accounts to me, in trust for mother's care. Since Natalie hasn't been part of this family daily life, he felt it was best to leave the responsibility in capable hands." A soft murmur rippled through the aunts and uncles. Megan looked at me, her chin tilted up, waiting for me to scream, to cry, to prove her right. I did nothing. I didn't even blink. "Actually, Megan," I said, my voice cutting through the murmurs like a scalpel, "before we talk about that directive, we need to talk about Dad's health during those 6 months. As a medical professional, I've been reviewing his charts. And yours, Mom." Megan's grip on the bell tightened until her knuckles were white. "This is not the time for a medical lecture, Natalie. You're just bitter because you've been cut out." "I'm not talking about money, Megan. I'm talking about felony elder abuse," I said. I stood up and walked to the center of the room. I pulled a stack of papers from my folder, the pharmacy records. "In the last 8 months, you've authorized 3,000 milligrams of lorazepam and hundreds of doses of quetiapine for a man who was already struggling with Parkinson, Megan. You didn't just sedate him, you paralyzed his mind so you could move his pen." "That a lie," Megan shouted, her voice cracking. "The doctor prescribed those." "No, Megan, you forged the authorizations. I have the digital logs from the pharmacy, and I have the photos of the unlabeled bottles you're currently using to drug our mother into silence." The room went cold. My Aunt Sarah gasped, leaning away from Megan. My mother blinked, a small spark of awareness flickering in her clouded eyes as she heard the word drug. "You're insane," Megan hissed, stepping toward me. "You have no proof of anything. I've been the one here. I've been the one sacrificing everything while you were off at your fancy hospital." "I have his voice, Megan," I said softly. I pulled the digital recorder from my pocket and pressed play. The volume was high. My father's rattling, weary voice filled the parlor. "Megan thinks I am under. She is talking about a cash buyer. Natalie, if you find this, the truth must be the last thing I say." The recording played for exactly 42 seconds. It was long enough for the entire Brooks family to hear the fear in a dying man's voice. It was long enough for my mother to let out a small, broken sob and look at Megan as if she were seeing a monster for the first time. Megan's face went from flushed red to a ghostly, sickly gray. She dropped the silver handbell. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp, discordant clang that seemed to vibrate through the very foundation of the house. "It's not what it sounds like," Megan stammered, looking around the room at the horrified faces of our family. He was confused. He didn't know what he was saying. "He knew exactly what he was saying, Megan," Marcus Turner said, his voice like iron. "And he knew you would try to steal his legacy. That's why he didn't just record that message. He told me where the real will was." Marcus walked over to the silver handbell lying on the floor. He picked it up. This bell had been used to summon my mother like a servant, to signal my father's decline, and to mock my absence. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, specialized screwdriver. The room held its breath. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Marcus unscrewed the small silver nut at the top of the bell's handle. He pulled the wooden handle away from the silver dome. Inside the hollowed-out grip of the handle was a tightly rolled piece of thin, high-quality vellum. "This," Marcus said, holding the paper up, "is the holographic will of Thomas Brooks, written and witnessed in secret 1 year ago. In it, he revokes all previous powers of attorney granted to Megan Brooks. He leaves the family home to Natalie Brooks, with the express condition that it be used for the lifetime care of Evelyn Brooks. And he leaves Megan exactly $1, noting that she has already distributed over $180,000 of family funds to herself over the last 2 years. $180,000. The number hung in the air like a physical weight. Megan collapsed back against the fireplace mantel. He couldn't. "I did everything for him." "You did everything to him," I corrected her. I stepped forward until I was inches from her face. I didn't feel the need to shout. The truth was loud enough. "I'm not going to jail for you, Megan, but I am calling the authorities. The medical board, the police, and the forensic accountants are already on their way. You have 10 minutes to take your personal clothes and get out of this house." "You can't kick me out. I have nowhere to go." "You have the luxury condo you bought with dad money," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "Or you did, until Marcus filed the injunction this morning to freeze your assets. You wanted to play the hero, Megan. Now, you get to play the defendant." I turned to my mother. For the first time in years, I saw her reaching out. Her hand was shaking, but it wasn't the drugs this time. It was a reach for connection. I took her hand. It felt cold, but I knew I could make it warm again. "It's over, Mom," I whispered. "The fog is going to lift now, I promise." The relatives began to stand, their murmurs turning into a roar of indignation directed at Megan. She stood alone by the fireplace, the golden child finally exposed as brass. She looked at the silver bell in Marcus' hand, the weapon she had used to rule this house. It was just a piece of metal now. The power was gone. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 1 hour and 15 minutes since the meeting began. In 75 minutes, I had dismantled a decade of lies. I wasn't happy. I wasn't celebrating. I was just, finally, at peace. Megan left that afternoon with 2 suitcases and a face full of static. She didn't look back at the house, and she didn't look at me. The police stayed for 3 hours, taking statements and collecting the unlabeled bottles from the bathroom. Marcus handled the legal paperwork with the cold efficiency of a man who had seen too many families tear themselves apart. By the time the sun went down, the house was finally quiet. Not the heavy, drugged silence of the last few months, but a hollow, expectant quiet. Megan left that afternoon with 2 suitcases and a face full of static. She didn't look back at the house, and she didn't look at me. The police stayed for 3 hours, taking statements and collecting the unlabeled bottles from the bathroom. Marcus handled the legal paperwork with the cold efficiency of a man who had seen too many families tear themselves apart. By the time the sun went down, the house was finally quiet. Not the heavy, drugged silence of the last few months, but a hollow, expectant quiet. My mother's recovery was not a movie montage. It was slow, gritty, and often painful. For the first 2 weeks, I took a leave of absence from the hospital to monitor her detoxification. I watched her go through the tremors, the confusion, and the bouts of weeping as the chemical fog lifted and the reality of Dad's death finally hit her. There were nights when she would wake up screaming for Megan, her mind still caught in the loop of manipulation. I stayed. I held her hand. I used my training to keep her safe, but I used my heart to keep her whole. 1 month later, the color began to return to her cheeks. We spent our mornings in the garden, pulling the weeds that Megan had allowed to choke the roses. We didn't talk about the money or the court dates. We talked about the way the light hit the mountains and the recipes my grandmother used to make. As for the money, I didn't keep a single cent of the $180,000 Megan had stolen. Once the accounts were unfrozen and the legal battles settled, I put every penny into a protected trust for Mom's long-term care and a scholarship fund for nursing students specializing in geriatric ethics. I didn't want the weight of that money in my pockets. I wanted the weight of the truth off my shoulders. Megan is currently facing 3 felony counts of fraud and 1 count of elder neglect. Her high-end real estate license was revoked, and her golden reputation in Portland has vanished like smoke. I haven't spoken to her since the day of the will reading. I don't hate her. Hate requires an energy I'm no longer willing to give her. I simply feel nothing. One rainy Tuesday morning, I found the silver handbell sitting on the kitchen counter. It looked smaller than I remembered, less intimidating. I picked it up, feeling the cool weight of the silver against my palm. For years, this object had been a symbol of a family in distress, a signal for help, and eventually, a tool for a sister cruelty. I walked out to the back porch and looked at the old oak tree where Dad used to build birdhouses. I didn't ring the bell. I didn't need to summon anyone anymore. I took a heavy velvet bag, placed the bell inside, and tucked it into the very back of a storage trunk in the attic. I wasn't throwing away the history, but I was silencing the control. The house belongs to us now, not as a prize of war, but as a sanctuary for the living. I am Natalie Brooks. I am an ER nurse, a daughter, and finally, a woman who is no longer afraid of the silence. My father's voice is gone, but his truth is loud and clear, and for the first time in my life, I can breathe without looking over my shoulder. If this story meant something to you, if you believe that the truth is worth fighting for even when it's painful, please leave a comment below. I want to hear your thoughts. Like and subscribe to join our community of storytellers and seekers of justice. Thank you for walking this path with me.